wonderful to have you here. Today, what I want to do is discuss one aspect of mindfulness of breathing that we often don't think about, although it plays a major role in our practice, for many of us anyway. That's counting. If you're new to this channel of mine and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So one of the secrets, I think, behind living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life involves meditation. And perhaps the most famous, most practiced form of meditation that most of us will know about is meditation on the breath. That is where we focus on our in-breath and then our out-breath. And that continual focus will enable us over time to calm down and get a clearer view on our lives. It's sort of the baseline, the basic practice that we all, or at least many of us, will think is necessary for us. And one of the ways that many of us practice this is through counting. That is, we'll count the breaths. We count up to a certain number, and then we start again. And that's one of the ways that we can keep a focus on our breath. However, there's an interesting fact about counting that I think is often overlooked or not understood, not known, which is that it is a relatively late practice. If you look at the early texts on breath meditation, on how we should do breathing meditation, you don't find any mention of counting. So it seems that the Buddha and his disciples didn't count their breaths. They don't seem to have known anything about that practice. So where does it come from and when? And why? These are questions that I will try to answer in today's video, or at least point to possible answers. And so what I'll do is to look through some of the earliest texts that we have that discuss mindfulness of breathing with counting, and then at the end give some potential speculations on why counting arose as a practice. So when and why did counting start as a practice? It's impossible to say for sure, but scholar Florian Delianu has pointed to a number of early sutras called the Dhyana Sutras, as well as aspects of the Abhidharma, which is a period of Buddhist philosophy that happened right after the Buddha's lifetime and for a few centuries thereafter in compiling his ideas. However, he says that he believes that counting began perhaps in the 1st or 2nd centuries before the Common Era. That said, in his estimation, and in all the estimation of people that I can at least discover in a quick, relatively quick search around, it appears as though the earliest written evidence of mindfulness of breathing with counting, that is to say, where we use counting, is in a text called the Vimuttimagga, or the Path of Freedom. Now, this is a text that was composed somewhere around the 1st or 2nd centuries of the Common Era, and then translated into Chinese in the 6th century of the Common Era. It's still a matter of controversy where and when and by whom it was written. While there is some evidence pointing to perhaps Sri Lanka, perhaps the Abhayagiri monastery in Sri Lanka, which is an early monastery that had practitioners from many, many different Buddhist sects, all sort of practicing together. However, that's unclear still, and so we really don't know where the Vimuttimagga arose. In any event, in the Vimuttimagga we find that mindfulness of breathing is discussed in 2 different ways. It says there that certain predecessors not only described mindfulness of breathing in terms of its traditional 16 stages, but also in terms of 4 stages. Let me be clear here. In the early Buddhist texts, in the suttas I should say, we find the Buddha discussing mindfulness of breathing in 16 stages. And so that's relatively well understood, well known. However, there seems to have arose a different practice as well, which is this 4-stage practice. And the 4-stage practice is counting, connection, contacting, and fixing. Now, I'm not going to describe all of these 4 stages here. That's not really the point of this video. The point here is to describe the first stage in particular, which is counting. In other words, what we have are two different practices of mindfulness of breathing, the second one seeming to have arisen in the centuries after the Buddha's lifetime, beginning with counting. So how do we practice this counting according to the Vimuttimagga? There we read a question, what is counting? And here's the answer. A new practitioner, yogin is a practitioner, counts the breaths from 1 to 10, beginning with the outgoing breath and ending with the incoming breath. He does not count beyond 10. Again, it's taught that he counts from 1 to 5, but does not count beyond 5. He does not miss. At that time, that is, when he misses, he should count the next, or stop that count. So the instruction here is really relatively clear. We basically count the breath from 1 to 5 or 1 to 10. It discusses both options, so I guess you have two options according to this text. And if you make a mistake, either you go on to the next number if you happen to have missed a number, got the wrong number for some reason, or you simply begin again at 1. That sort of is, in fact, very, very close to the practice that many of us have to this very day with counting. Usually we count from 1 to 10 and then go back to 1, and if we miss our place, if we forget where we are, we simply start again at 1. Once we've mastered counting, then we move on to the next stage, which is called connection, where we simply follow the breath as it is without counting. So here we understand that counting is sort of a preliminary exercise to get us to follow the breath without counting at all. Now, to move on, the Vimuttimagga, this text we've been discussing, was seems to have been one of the source texts for a very, very important compendium of Buddhist thought called the Visuddhimagga, which is a text written around the 5th century by Buddhaghosa, who was a very famous person within the Theravada lineage. And indeed, within the Theravada school, Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga is considered a sort of a complete encyclopedia of all of Buddhist teachings. It's sort of like if you were to encompass all of the Buddhist Dharma within a single text. In the much of the Theravada, the Visuddhimagga is considered that way. Now, Buddhaghosa compiled the Visuddhimagga with reference to much earlier material. In other words, he didn't sort of come up with it out of nowhere. Not only did he have access to the suttas, the suttas of the Buddha, but he also had an enormous amount of secondary literature, and it seems as though the Vimuttimagga was one such piece of literature. So it seems that Buddhaghosa looked to the Vimuttimagga to help him, especially in particular, I should say, with this issue of counting. In other words, it seems as though Buddhaghosa may have gotten the idea of counting from the Vimuttimagga. However, his own his own description of this counting is quite a bit more detailed and in-depth than we find in the Vimuttimagga. Now, there's too much in Buddhaghosa's text for me to get into in this video, but in a nutshell, we'll discuss the sort of the highlights here. First of all, he says that counting is a practice for a beginner, which is something that we might understand from the Vimuttimagga as well. It's not really something that's expected to be used by somebody who's very advanced, or at least not for very long. Buddhaghosa also says we should not count to less than 5, nor should we count to higher than 10, nor should we stop in the middle. And he gives reasons for all of these. He says that we shouldn't count to less than 5 because, he says, thoughts get excited by the cramped space. So in other words, if we count from 1 to 3 or 1 to 4, we're sort of spiraling in too tight of a spiral, I think. At least Buddhaghosa feels that way. And so we can become sort of too excitable. We're not able to calm down because we're always starting again anew, rather than giving ourselves a little bit more space by counting at least to the number 5. Okay, and he says that we're not supposed to count higher than 10 because, he says, thoughts take the number rather than the breaths as their support. So in other words, if we count to higher than 10, we're liable to focus too much on the numbers. The point here really is to focus on the breath and simply use counting as a kind of a crutch. If we start counting higher than 10, though, then we really do need to focus on which number we're at. We may begin to think, how high can I get? How high can I count? can I count to 30? Can I count to 100? Can I count to 1,000? Or wherever, in other words, if our space of counting gets too big, it takes too central a role in our practice. Now, Buddhaghosa also says that we shouldn't stop in the middle, he says, because if we do so, we'll wonder if the meditation subject is completed. In other words, if we stop in the middle, we may sort of catch ourselves up too quickly to the point where our mind sort of thinks that we're done with our practice, which obviously is not the intent of it. We're really supposed to have a practice that gets us closer and closer focused onto the breath. Now, he also goes on to say when we should count. He says that we should start by counting late in the breath. And he gives a simile. Buddhaghosa gives a simile of measuring out grain. So if let's say you have a measuring scoop and you're measuring out grain, you pour the grain into that scoop or that recipient, and once the recipient is full, then you dump it out and you say 1, and you do the same, and when it's full you say 2. And in the same way, he says when we're beginning to count, we should count at the end of the breath. So that is to say, we're focusing on the breath as it is complete, and once the breath is complete, let's say the in-breath is complete, then we count 1. Then once the out-breath is complete, then we count 2. So we're sort of using counting as a final seal on our ability to have followed that particular breath. Whereas, Buddhaghosa goes on to say, as we get more skilled in the practice, or as we get more concentrated, then we can begin to count at the beginning of the breath. And here he gives a different simile. He says it's like a cowherd who's counting the cows as they come into the stable. Basically, he doesn't have to wait till the entire cow is in. Simply once he sees the cow beginning to enter, he says 1. Then when he sees the next cow, he says 2. And in the same way, as we get more proficient at this, we can count at the beginning of the breath rather than at the end. And so it's with the help of this practice, as Buddhaghosa says, it's with the help of that very counting that the mind becomes unified, just as a boat in a swift current is steadied with the help of a rudder. That is to say, that rudder, that thing that we're doing, that activity that we hold that rudder and steer, keeps us on the straight and narrow in a turbulent stream. In the same way, our activity with the mind in watching the breaths and counting them, which is a kind of at least minor activity that we're taking on, that we're undergoing, that keeps our minds focused in the same way. Then he goes on to say that we remain counting until, without counting, mindfulness remains settled on the in-breaths and out-breaths as its object. So again, counting is only a temporary kind of practice that we're supposed to do until we can settle the mind upon the breath. Once the mind becomes settled, then we leave the counting aside. Now, once again, in the non-Theravada world, we also find counting in Vasubandhu's very important work, the Abhidharmakośabhāsyam. And this is a text written in about the 4th or the 5th century of the Common Era. It is a real compendium of Buddhist theory, of Buddhist thought, of Buddhist Dharma, in much the same way that the Buddhaghosa's Visuddhimagga is. And in that text as well, that is to say the Abhidharmakośabhāsyam, we also find, as I say, a description of counting with the breaths. It's a compact description. It's not as compendious, it's not as lengthy as Buddhaghosa's, but nevertheless, it's an important thing to consider. In that text, it says to let the body and the mind be as they are. In other words, we're not trying to change the breathing, we're not trying to change the body, we're not really trying to change the mind, although it will change as we become more calmed down as we follow the breaths. And then it says that we're not to count to any less than 10, nor are we to count to any more than 10. So this is even more specific than Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa said not less than 5. Here in this text we read not less than or more than 10. So 10 is really our desired number as far as the Abhidharmakośabhāsyam goes. And then it says that we are simply to continue the process of counting. If we lose our place, once again, as we read in other texts, we just start again at 1, and we continue the process of counting until we reach samadhi, until we reach a stage of calm at which we can follow the breaths without counting at all. Now, having looked at these early descriptions of counting practice with the breath, I think it may come to our minds to wonder why this was developed. Why didn't it begin with the Buddha? Why did this develop later on? There's obviously no way to know for sure. It certainly is also possible that the Buddha simply never thought of counting. That is to say, it's quite possible that if somebody had suggested counting to the Buddha, he might have said, "Oh, that's a good idea, go right ahead and do it." It's also possible that people in the Buddha's day did count, but it just never got included in one of the early suttas. So there are many possible options here, and we really shouldn't rule out any of them absolutely. Nevertheless, one recent scholar, Anālayo, Bhikkhu Anālayo, who does a lot of work in early Buddhism, a wonderful scholar of the early material, he has, in a recent paper, come out with at least a possible suggestion, a theoretical possibility as to why this began, as to why counting began as a practice. What Anālayo says is that it seems over the early centuries after the Buddha's lifetime as though the practice of mindfulness of breathing got slowly compressed. That is to say, in the Buddha's lifetime, as we mentioned earlier, the practice of mindfulness of breathing was a practice in 16 stages. It was really quite a lengthy and involved practice, quite a lengthy and involved process, one that would presumably take quite a bit of time. But it seems as though in the centuries thereafter, this practice began to be whittled down to fewer and fewer stages. And over time, it began to be seen more and more as though the entire practice of mindfulness of breathing could essentially be encompassed by the first two stages of mindfulness of breathing. That is to say, focusing on whether the in or out breath is short, focusing on whether the in or out breath is long. So simply by focusing on the character of our in and out breaths, that was enough. That was sufficient to practice mindfulness of breathing. And indeed, I think many of us, when told this, that will probably ring a bell, because indeed nowadays, when mindfulness of breathing is taught, basically that's what we're taught, just simply to follow the breath and nothing more. And maybe to see that the breath is long or short, obviously whether we're breathing in or out, but that's about it. And as Anālayo goes on to say, as a result of such reduction, it's not surprising that other techniques had to be relied on in order to enable meditators to stay with the breath. That is to say, early on in the practice, this 16-stage practice really was considered what was necessary to counter distraction. In other words, the whole point of doing mindfulness of breathing is to counter distraction, to overcome the 5 hindrances to meditation. And it was presumably sufficient for that, but as the number of stages got whittled down to simply 2, or at least a very small number, it was no longer quite as sufficient to counter distraction. In other words, the distractions kept coming up now. Perhaps we got bored with simply following the breath. And so, as Anālayo suggests, perhaps other teachers came up with other kinds of practices that would help stabilize the mind in this much more compressed set of practices. Now, one early text in the Yogacara tradition, called the Yogacara Bhumi, mentions that mindfulness of breathing is really only for those of dull faculties. In other words, it's not only is it for beginners, but it's for beginners that really are pretty slow. And perhaps I'm one of those who's in that group, because I find counting to be quite useful to me, although, you know, as with all things, you have to mix up your practices, otherwise they become too stale. It's also important to note that mindfulness of breathing, in mindfulness of breathing, the point is to focus on the breath. And so we have to be a little careful when we're using counting, because counting, when we bring counting to our practice, what we're bringing is a very conceptual kind of mind operation, another thing that we're doing while we're breathing. And if we focus on that mental operation, on that conceptualization too much, we're sort of getting out of the point of mindfulness of breathing. We're going to be less able, I think, or at least other meditative teachers have said this, that it's going to be harder for us to calm down if we get too lost in the numbers. So if we're going to be using this practice, we have to use it judiciously. Anālayo goes on to say, "It seems indeed advisable not to regard counting as the default mode for approaching mindfulness of breathing, and rather see it as a skillful means that can at times be helpful if employed with circumspection." By which Anālayo basically means that we have to be careful. Mindfulness of breathing with counting is a good practice, but it's one that we shouldn't be relying upon all the time. And once again, this is something that I take to heart because I have indeed relied upon counting for many, many years at stretches, and indeed found that I was able to count even while my mind was off in another world. So, you know, you have to, I think, let me put it this way, Anālayo's advice is well taken. I think it would be good, though, to go back to the 16-stage, the original 16-stage idea of mindfulness of breathing. And in fact, I have a whole playlist about that 16-stage practice, and I'll put a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it yet, or if you want a refresher. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, please consider taking a look over at my Patreon page and considering if you want to help out and support the channel. Thanks so much to all of you, and I'll catch you on the next video. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.